Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. We're coming to you live from the Singapore FinTech Festival, and joining me for this segment, we have Jill Propson. She's the Head of Technology and Innovation in Financial Services at the World Economic Forum. We're here to discuss FinTech growth in an evolving environment. Drew, it is great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thank you, really a pleasure to be here.
You got it. Let's talk about some of the tailwinds that we experienced from the pandemic. How has FinTech evolved as a result of that?
Yeah, so at the World Economic Forum, we've done quite a bit of research in the FinTech space over the years, and particularly during the pandemic, we wanted to see how the pandemic was impacting FinTech. Of course now, we know it was a huge tailwind, everybody went digital. So we saw consumer growth rates for FinTechs extremely high then, so well over 50%. After the pandemic, we really, or as things were winding down, we wanted to continue the research, and we've done a lot of this in collaboration with the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance to collect data to run a large survey with different FinTechs across the globe. And as we did this, what we were seeing is post-pandemic, we thought there'd be a huge pullback. There actually wasn't, which was really nice to see. So last year, or I'd say in January of this year, we published data from data collected last year, so it would have been 2022 data, showing that already then the growth was still around 50-51% globally. So really quite positive that there wasn't a great pullback.
Are there any challenges to maintain those growth rates?
Absolutely, and in fact we're actually running another survey right now, and we have some early findings from this, so I can't say we have strong data points yet, but there are early indications that we're actually seeing a bit of a drop in that, so around 37% right now in terms of growth rates. So that's going to be a little bit difficult, maybe we'll bring it up later, but the funding environment is certainly a little bit challenging, but also just it's not what it was a couple years ago where capital was free flowing, so we're seeing some headwinds as well.
Yeah, but there has to be some expectation that the pendulum will somewhat come back to the middle here. I mean, you can only have growth at those rates for so long, but before we get into the funding environment, what about the regulatory environment? Is it enabling or hindering innovation?
A little bit of both, but I would say definitely more on the enabling side. So as we ran this survey, we asked FinTechs as well what their perception of the regulatory environment was. Really pleased to say very high this year, 63% said it was adequate for their needs, and they were actually quite pleased with it. And interestingly, the indicators for this next survey, we're seeing that the data is showing that's even a little bit higher. APAC in particular is very strong, around 70%, so it's nice to see these approval rates that are quite high. At the same time, when we ask about certain areas that might be hindering growth going forward, we do see that compliance costs are pretty high. We also see that there are areas where maybe it's a little bit complex in the registration processes. So certainly there are areas of improvement when it comes to both policymaking and the regulatory environment, but it's pretty strong.
What about the funding environment? We had briefly mentioned it before that it's somewhat coming back down to more normalized levels. Are you encouraged by that? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, again, it's a little bit of both, right? It's a mixed bag. So if you look at the drop from the highs, which is 2021, we're talking about a 67% drop at least, right? It's come down a lot. And I'm talking about VC funding in particular. Now, if we look at the numbers, that looks pretty dramatic and pretty terrible. At the same time, if you think about it, the funding was too great before, right? I mean, there were a lot of businesses that really didn't have a great business model. There was no long-term profitability, and they were getting funded, and that was really hurting some of the competitive dynamics. So I think now we're in a very realistic environment. So if you do have a good business, it's actually quite a good time to be a FinTech. But it does mean that it's going to be a little bit more challenging than earlier to find that funding right away.
All right, appreciate the insight, Drew. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. And thanks for joining me from the Singapore FinTech Festival. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.